Hi, I'm Mary Bosworth. I'm Director of Border Criminologies, and I'm here today with Vicky Canning, who is one of the Associate Directors of Border Criminologies, and we're making this short film for International Women's Day 2020. We're here today to discuss Vicky's work on women seeking asylum in Britain, Denmark and Sweden. So Vicky, how did you start in this area?
Well, I used to work with a local organisation on rape crisis and felt that there was some gaps in terms of the ways in which we respond to women seeking asylum who've experienced violence in conflict and during migration. And I think back in those days when you have this idea where your priority is, oh, we must find support for women who have been subjected to, women that I'd met had experienced multiple perpetrator rape, various forms of domestic violence, abuse, violence that I would define and have defined as torturous violence. So while not seen as torture legally, I would consider it to be torture. And then I actually realised that the kinds of borders that women were experiencing were so intrusive in the everyday that actually being able to even get to this point of engaging in support, whether it's counselling or psychosocial or anything, this was impeded further. So it started to become clearer that actually the everyday kinds of borders that we see, in terms of time, poverty, destitution, maybe being tied to spousal visas, these were causing further problems in terms of actually being able to access support. So it became more evident that the borders were compounding problems rather than solving them, and sometimes even, impacting negatively on women's mental health. So that's where I started to maybe change from my priorities to recognising that women's priorities were not the same as my original objectives.
And how did you move from working on this in terms of being engaged with a civil society organisation and with women themselves, how did you move from that into an academic study?
It's always a good question because I would call myself an activist and an academic. And sometimes I feel more comfortable in activist settings than I do in academic settings. But effectively, I think being able to use the same kinds of grassroots organisational skills and think about how to engage people, especially in the northwest of England at the time in Liverpool. And I think again, when we start to recognise some of the kinds of harms of governmental policies around us, you start to recognise that maybe these are the discussions that we should be having in academia rather than the original discussions that we might think are priorities. So it was more about thinking about how to move what you can actually see in the everyday into what we prioritise in terms of evidence, empirical research, and distributing what we see and what knowledge we produce from it.
And since you are a criminologist, was there any pushback about including this population within a criminological study? Did anyone ever say to you, that's all very interesting, but that's not criminology? Or is it because the harms that the women have experienced were crimes, does it fit more easily into the discipline?
I don't think it fits into the discipline very well at all, and I think that there are tensions between my work on criminology, because I would say that criminology in itself still uses the same not all the time, but beyond critical criminology, normative, often state-centric approaches to regulations of people. And in the context of migration, actually a lot of these things that you see in the everyday are not related to criminal justice whatsoever. They mirror them, they mirror social controls, but I think that fits in two senses as well. I mean, obviously in sociology and the sociology of deviance, but certainly within semiology and how we start to think about how we study social harms and knit those with what we recognise are processes or that mirror processes of criminalisation. So it does fit, and there are discussions about criminology, particularly in the use of immigration detention, which obviously you've pioneered a lot of the UK's work on that. So that there are these knitting togethers of crime-based agendas or criminalisation-based agendas. But actually, in what affects people in the everyday outside of detention or outside of people who are criminalised for migration-related offences is aspects of harm, and also, you know, surviving harm, and building forms of resistance to not only survive harm but actually to mitigate the ways in which it exists and perforates every day.
So can you tell me a little bit about the kinds of experiences that the women who you've worked with have had, either before they arrived or once they get into the asylum system in the 3 countries that you work on?
Well, I think this is where feminist work and theory practice and activism come in, is recognising forms of continuums of violence. So rather than doing sort of mass interviews, generally I try to spend time with women over periods of time, over months or sometimes years, in as a non-intrusive or invasive way as possible, involved in different groups, grassroots organisations that I've long been involved in. And that's about building, with undertaking, so that would be undertaking oral histories. And with this you start to see structural violences in women's histories. So, you know, not being able to go to school in certain areas, or experiencing childhood sexual abuse. And then how sometimes these can develop. So women that I've met who've been in conflict areas have experienced multiple perpetrator rape or continuums of rape in their lives. Interestingly, and also worryingly, I think, are the ways in which those continuums can both move across migratory journeys but also manifest whilst in in asylum systems, for example. So there are certain aspects that I think women can experience that are a little are quite unique to gendered experiences of borders. So for example, in Denmark, in women who live in asylum systems, asylum centres, these are often spatially excluded in the middle of nowhere. So this not only means that if you're a carer for kids, for example, you have more problems going back and forth to certain, you know, to a city or a town, or to go even grocery shopping becomes a problem because you've got to pick your kids up at 11 o'clock and then leave them back off at 1 o'clock or whatever the times are. So you've got these kinds of spatial controls, but also I think further potentials for violences, including exploitation, as we've seen in immigration detention in the UK as an example. Exploitation from men who have been living in the area, from harassment in centres. And this is not to say all men, and this is of course, you know, one of the key issues is the dynamics of gendered violence are very complicated. But what you can really evidence is that it's been very seldom that the women that I've worked with have had one-off experiences. That said, I think from the Gendered Harm book a few years ago, a woman that I spent some years with doing an oral history, or some months, and followed up with, you know, one subjection to sexual violence in her life led to long-term physical implications. She contracted HIV and became pregnant, and so I think effectively there's multiple experiences that women can have, and that women that I've met and undertaken research with as part of as participants working. But I think it's always important to emphasize that one doesn't undermine the other. So one subjection to violence doesn't mean that everyone has experienced a continuum of violence. It's that really in the everyday we should be reducing the impacts of previous violences and reducing the potential for further violence in women's lives, particularly with the recognition that you know, there are forms of violence from conflict related areas or during migratory journeys that can be disproportionately experienced by women who are seeking asylum. Yeah.
And have you found substantial differences either in the women's experiences across the 3 countries or in the systems? I mean, are there, so as not to be totally sad all the time about how the world is. Are there any practices in any countries which are helpful to the women, which are sort of having some positive effect that you've seen in the women you've worked with, or is the story everywhere just one of bleak despair?
I laugh because I bring everybody despair everywhere I go.
I think everybody does.
Yeah, probably. But I think, I mean, it actually is ironic because I don't feel despair. I all the time. I think whenever I work at institutional levels, I really can feel despair and grinding, because you can see a lack of recognition between lived reality and these sort of ideas and policies that you just know are going to make people's lives worse, and that is despairing, to be honest. But you know, for the years that I've worked with, for example, the fantastic Migrant Artist Mutual Aid or Right to Remain, the experience of you know, being part of a collective and seeing problem solving amongst women is always, I don't want to say, I mean, it is inspirational, but I also at the same time, you know, I don't like, for example, I mean, I've really problematised resilience literatures. You know, we can't have always happy endings, and I think there's a push for this in criminological literature, where we like to have a happy ending for things that are, you know, really problematic, and we can't have happy stories for white people about what borders are doing. At the same time, you know, it's amazing to meet women who've been subjected to things that, to be honest, really, I know I wouldn't be able to come through some of the things that women that I've met have come through, and to see organise and take back power and control in lives in you know, really, really amazing ways. But at that same time, I don't feel that people should be in the position where they have to do that. So I think grassroots level, I feel like I don't always feel in despair, actually. I just wish that there were different ways in which we go about impacting on people who are, you know, stuck in border regimes or in these asylum systems.
And so in the UK at the moment, one of the key terms that the state uses in trying to work with women is this concept of vulnerability. So vulnerability, and it's not just the state, of course, who uses that term, it's also NGOs and civil society organisations are couching their gender-based policies in terms of women's particular vulnerability. Do you have a view on the utility of that as an organising principle?
I do have a view there.
I'm surprised.
It's a shocker. Yes, I do. I mean, I think that the discourses have come out, which I hope I don't perpetuate, are that women are unable or you know, totally disenfranchised in society. There is an aspect of disenfranchisement that is placed through these complex webs of bordering, and also through other forms of patriarchal controls. Let's be honest, I mean, sometimes I've known women for periods of time and then over months or years realise that the man that they're in a relationship is actually a violent relationship, that she's been subjected to further forms of domestic violence. So, you know, not underplaying any of this. So the two things that I would say about vulnerability is that there is the best intention, I think, especially by NGOs and advocates, they're working with women to recognise these structural disenfranchisements as being inherently vulnerable. And we see this through discourse, you know, women and children, and infantilising of women. Any women who've, you know, made it through serious, you know, from persecution or torture or violence, through migrating, you know, with kids often with them, and then living for periods of time, months, years, with no autonomy, based on poverty, based on not being allowed to access or able to access higher education, these sorts of things. That vulnerability, that idea of vulnerability isn't reflective of what women, it undermines what women have managed to survive. Our real focus should be on facilitating support in that sense whether it's sexual violence support or whether it's financial support or support to learn or whatever that we want to do as humans, but also to support in ending the ways in which these impact on women and the kinds of ways they impact. The other on vulnerability, which I find is the greatest irony of all, is to hear the ways in which maybe governments or people in parliament sometimes discuss vulnerability as if this is something inherent to women's identity, without recognising that women are being made more vulnerable by state policies, by governmental decisions, by destitution. We know that whenever women, we know these things, these are not surprises, we know that if women are left in poverty, that the potential for forms of exploitation increase based on gendered inequalities. We know this. We know that if women have children and are forcibly dependent on partners, potentially violent partners, this facilitates further temporal vulnerabilities. These are not new knowledges. So there is a bit of a frustration for me that the same sorts of border regimes talk about vulnerable women and responding to vulnerable women when women themselves sometimes say, I don't see how I'm treated any differently by these housing officers coming in controlling me in my house, or having to be dispersed at the last minute and having to move, having to go and be signing on to the Home Office, all these kinds of micro controls, how these are any different to my violence, from my ex or my husband or whatever. This is something that's a problem. These are extensions of a patriarchal state, and it's not enough to come up with ideas to stop this mythology of inherent vulnerability. What we need to be talking about is ending the conditions under which women are more likely to be disenfranchised or exploited, which then leads to vulnerability in certain senses.
Yeah, well, I guess that's one of the issues, is that vulnerability becomes a personal problem, whereas what you're saying and what we all know is that these are structural issues, and so it's that way in which somehow we need to keep reminding everybody to pay more attention to the structural causes.
And just to say on that, just the last thing is, this also then brings us into really problematic victim discourses, where if you've survived trafficking, or if you have survived, I've met women who've been, some of the women that I've worked with who've been forcibly imprisoned by partners, for example, and subjected to repeated sexual abuses. If you don't fit the perfect victim of this, then you're not vulnerable enough.
Yeah.
So we end up with scales of vulnerability, and women that I know are aware of this and are. So whilst if you have a bad day, sometimes you think, oh, I'm gonna go out and do this, or I'm gonna do that, or Vicky, you're finally gonna brush your hair this week after sitting in this office writing whatever miserable thing that you're imposing on the world. We do all these things as people. Women often, I've had conversations with women who they feel like they can't get up and look like they're surviving, because if they do, they're not victim enough, they're not vulnerable enough. That's not a fair or human way forward. We need to, I think that fits with a lot of other feminist issues and objectives about what we expect in terms of vulnerability and femininity. And we know this plays into court cases and appeals. If you're not victim enough, if you're not seen to be vulnerable enough, then you're probably not credible enough to be a victim of trafficking or sexual abuse or.
Yeah. So can I ask about the dry question now, which is actually a methods question. Oh. So you work with the same people, or with a group of people for fairly long periods of time, and how does that work methodologically? Like, do you have a field note diary? Do you record things? Is it and do you switch between roles? Like, are you sometimes Vicky, the senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Bristol, and sometimes Vicky, the support worker, or are you just Vicky? Like, how do you navigate those different aspects?
Well, I think I would never say that I'm really a support worker. I try to intervene in ways that what are deemed in academia to be like expertise, right? You know, thinking about, you know, does this refusal consider particular social groups or anything? We know, for example, like legal aid. I can't give any legal advice, obviously, legally. We know that legal aid has been reduced, especially for, you know, rights of family life cases, etc. But what is useful sometimes is, you know, if you can just pinpoint what this, so that you can, if you go through something, for example, you can pinpoint and say, this is, if you know, point this out to your lawyer, so that your lawyer who's got less time can take time, so you can have things like this. Or we put together, for example, a book, strategies for survival, recipes for resistance, to raise funds for legal aid, but also to get across information. So once you start to see these things, you think, you know, how do we get other people to see how awful it is to get this refusal, how heartless refusals can read, and what it must feel like to say, yeah, we believe that you've been trafficked, but we're still not going to give you, you know, we're still not going to give you humanitarian protection or refugee status or whatever. So there are different ways that you can use those sorts of skills, I think, to different advantages. I kind of, in terms of senior lecturing, I think, I mean, I've really actually, I have to say, I've really enjoyed since I've been at Bristol. I've been given access to, you know, did I want to write 2 modules? Of course, everyone goes, I'd love to write 2 modules. I have nothing else to do but write. No, but I've actually really enjoyed it. So on globalisation, harm, crime and justice, and another one on violence, conflict and forced migration, and supporting students and to see the kinds of violences in ways that are both structural and individual. So in that sense, I think a lot of the histories that come through, and I think for students, I feel like students are often undermined in what they want. So there's this idea developed by certain mechanisms in the neoliberal university where students just want, you know, tick box things or events or movies or whatever. Actually, whenever you talk to students, they love to learn. And the discussions that you have from them, actually, you learn back and forth, don't you? But also I think it gives avenues for people to think, oh, where students might come and say, you know, where could I go and maybe do something that supports in this way? So you can do all these different things. Obviously, you've got a position of power when you're in academia that you don't have in other places.
But when you're actually in the groups with the women in the room with you, are you there as a researcher? Is everything that you're witnessing, is that stuff that you could write about, or do you have to sort of say, today I'm doing research, tomorrow I'm doing activism, to keep them separate? Yeah.
So I wouldn't use anything from my activist. So you kind of imagine what I've been doing for years in activist senses has been, you know, organising or working with, you know, everything from rallies and protests to, you know, sitting cross-legged in a vegan collective with chickens walking around talking to women about what avenues they can go to get support in, you know, sexual abuse support or something. So that is not what I would ever consider. If there is something that I think is particularly, so I might reflect in one example, I did reflect actually for a Border Criminologies blog, I think, on something that then did become, so I developed an asylum navigation board with Right to Remain, and it was a personal reflection. So I've made no mention of the woman that I was speaking to, but the experience of, I think there is something about knowing what the structures are like in asylum and seeing the impacts of them on people and reflecting on that yourself and thinking, because that was a pivotal point, an accumulation of pivotal points where you think, you know, it's just not fair that people think that they are the failures in this. How do we find ways to recognise that actually this system is built like this and support people to know how to get through it, or what problems there might be faced? So, I mean, every now and then there might be something that's a vague reflection, but otherwise these things are separate. These things are separate unless women say, actually, interestingly, the other thing is, because I think there would be a problem if women only saw me as a researcher. I think there's an ethical dilemma there, where you would only be hearing from women, for example, who've experienced violence. Oh, there's that woman who wants to talk about violence. You would never get actually a snapshot of what borders are like. You'd be targeted to tell something too. So no, I've separate.
And so when you are doing research, do you take field notes, or do you record?
I don't record. I record oral histories.
Yeah.
I record oral histories because piecing together oral histories, I always say I'm never doing another oral history, and then I think that the depth of what you can see from it in the macro, meso, and micro levels, I don't think you can get it in through other methods. I don't feel anyway. I'm sure maybe other people do other methods much better than me, but I record then. I have field notes otherwise, and whenever I'm in other spaces, sometimes just pictures of things that remind me of the day. So never people, but just pictures of something that might have reminded me of witnessing a deportation or something where there's just like a smashed egg on the floor. I've got a picture of a smashed egg, and it relates to other things that happened around that, which sounds really silly, but then it brings me straight back to remembering the discussions we had before the smashed egg and whatever.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting. It's interesting the little things that trigger memories. Whenever I look at my field notes, mine are often fragmentary, and then I'll have quotes that people have said, and then I'll have sort of more fragments, and then it's just a matter of sort of sitting with them, and then you do go back to what you experienced. And I've started trying to write a sort of second lot of field notes where I actually do much more detailed just description of everything, but you can only do that if you have time. And so
time's an issue. The other thing though is it can really I find this can sometimes be absolutely horrible to go back to field notes, where unless I had to recently for a book chapter I'd been asked to write, and I thought I should write this book chapter, but I really don't want to. And it's and I went back to reflecting on what I would call a confinement continuum in Denmark. So there's the arrival centre Sandholm, then a deportation centre Sjælsmark, and then a detention centre Ellebæk. And remembering that day, and I was like, God, I think I tried so hard to get so much out of my memory that I then realised, God, how much I really hated that particular time. So that, I think, can also trigger stuff later on.
So that takes me to my next question very neatly, which is that you spend a lot of time with people who have had terrible experiences and in spaces which are themselves very harmful and upsetting. How do you manage that?
Well, Mary, this is why we're friends. Because this is what we do. Well, I manage it really well sometimes, and I manage it not very well sometimes.
Okay.
So when I manage it well, that's whenever I try to focus on, for example, writing about it and working through things or even analysing stuff. And then that's whenever also I feel like I've got the energy to do some of the things like the navigation board or the strategies for survival books with Migrant Artist Mutual Aid. But sometimes I have to say, you really do just feel like I cannot bear, and also when the political environment continues to become worse, I cannot bear the trajectory in which I can see this is going. And then I have to say, like, I don't know what it is that is, maybe it's working class guilt or something, but you think it would not be acceptable ethically to have people invest so much of their time and you to not bother yourself with discussing stuff or exposing stuff, which sometimes it is about exposing stuff actually, or about trying to find ways collectively to mitigate some of the harms or think differently about the harms as well. So, and that I think I have to emphasise that I don't think I always do that well either. And so it's not to pretend that like, oh, so this is on me. It's absolutely not that. I make mistakes regularly on a daily basis. So it isn't that. It's that you just think, you know, what a waste of other people's time. But it is tough sometimes, like, and then you again then feel guilty about thinking that it feels tough because you think, I'm not stuck. You know, I know people who are now 14 and 15 years into asylum system and just watching time go by, no right to work, living in poverty. I have no right to sort of mourn my position in this.
It's really difficult, isn't it? And I think it's difficult on a secondary level, which is that we are, of course, also teachers. And so when you have students who are going out and doing this sort of work, trying to prepare them for the sorts of emotions that they will feel, and exactly this issue, how you manage your own emotions when you know relative to the people who you're working with, they're you know, fairly inconsequential, but of course they are your own feelings and you have to manage your own feelings, and you know, lots of painful feelings make it hard to be creative, so it's hard to write. I think it's very much part of this whole field, and I have no massively helpful suggestions other than I think a certain amount of time passing helps. But I know exactly what you mean about having to go back to field notes and then reading it and remembering it and then not wanting to think about it. And it's a strangely it's a strange part of academic work because it's so saturated in emotions, and in a way we've got to keep some of them in, but we can't be overwhelmed by them. So it's hard.
And I think I think for me, well, I mean, I know I'm always banging on about the structural, but there is a structural consideration here that I don't think universities always necessarily give, and that is that there are some kinds of research that do require specific emotional investment or time, that you can't work with 100 students discussing violence because you cannot see if one student, you know, we forget we are all humans. Some of us have survived violence, some of us have been subjected to sexual violence. You can't pretend that we don't have histories, and I can't pretend that my students don't have histories. So it's very difficult if you've got, you know, especially as, again, you know, I mentioned the neoliberal university, but as we, you know, have these sort of finance models where we bring in more students, the less time we have to spend making sure actually our students are A, learning, and B, are they all right with this topic. I can't pretend to know if they're all right in the rest of their lives, nor is it my job. I'm not a counsellor, but I can try and make sure that people are okay. If that capacity is reduced for me, I think that's a problem. So I would definitely, you know, I would definitely encourage universities and departments and institutions and, you know, all of these faculties, everything, to take into consideration that, you know, the people around us are doing seriously emotionally laborious research. But sometimes, you know, you also don't know what you're going to hear when you go into the field. You don't know if you're going to spend the afternoon with somebody who's been subjected to multiple perpetrator rape, or if it's going to turn into, and you know, this is the same with practitioners, you know, or who you're going to spend the afternoon with. So actually, you know, then, to be honest, getting up and trying to pretend everything is okay the next day is not always the most feasible. And that's whenever I think, you know, it's great to have solidarity and support amongst colleagues and friends, and the organisations. I mean, the organisations that I work with are just brilliant. So they've always been sort of around. But I think it's a really important point.
Yeah.
Sometimes people forget to ask you how you actually are.
Yeah. No, I'm glad we have our Border Criminologies WhatsApp group.
Yeah. Even if I am sometimes singing Celine Dion on it, but yeah.
So that was, I mean, that's really the end of the questions that I prepared. I mean, I had one other one, which is about whether you think that, what the role is, I guess, of academic work in trying to bring about progressive social change for women seeking asylum.
It's a really good question. I think, so I've just recently been working on sort of a 6-point examples of how to do this and what we need to do, because I think that we do need to support organisations and their agendas. So we do need to, you know, open discussions about ending, for example, indefinite detention. But I also think that we are in disproportionately powerful positions where we can use language and call, as they say back at home, call a spade, or a spade in English. Just say things as they are. We have, we learn the theories, the concepts, we learn the language of power. We need to use these languages of power and address them, speak about them, and call them what they are. So I think, we've talked about this in the past, about, immigration detention, the discussions between reform. By all means, let's move toward short-term agendas that make people's lives easier. But I think we should also be using those voices to say, listen, these are based in neo-colonial ideas and ideologies. This is based on national identity and racism. We cannot seriously talk about decolonising the university, which is a very, big subject at the minute. We cannot seriously talk about this. Not use the languages of power to address the other racist and nationalist issues that we see in our research and work through Border Criminologies and border related research.
Good. I think we might end it there.
Okay.